I am Joshua, 29, and at my stepbrother's wedding dinner, he thought it would be a hilarious joke to introduce me to 120 high society guests as just a nurse. My own father burst out laughing right along with him. Before I tell you about how the bride's billionaire father froze the entire room and completely turned the tables, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I was sitting at table 14. If you have ever been to a high-end country club wedding, you know exactly what table 14 is. It is the table they wedge right next to the kitchen's swinging doors. It is the absolute edge of the room, the place where they hide the people they are forced to invite but do not want anyone to see. Every 30 seconds, a waiter with a massive tray of cleared plates would bump into the back of my chair. I was seated with a bored teenage babysitter who spent the entire time scrolling on her phone, a distant cousin who kept complaining about the temperature, and an empty chair. I was not there to be a guest. I was there to be accounted for, to check a box so my stepbrother could play the role of the generous, inclusive family man. I sat there in my dark gray suit, the only suit I owned, bought off the rack 3 years ago for a hospital gala. My hands were resting in my lap, and I kept running my thumb over the small pearl lapel pin attached to my jacket. It was a piece of my late mother's earring, repurposed by a cheap jeweler so I could carry a piece of her with me on important days. The Oakmont Country Club ballroom was completely stunning, almost suffocating in its wealth. Crystal chandeliers threw little rainbows across the vaulted ceiling. Women wearing Valentino dresses and men in custom tuxedos drank champagne that cost more than my weekly salary at the hospital. The air smelled like roasted filet mignon, expensive cedarwood perfume, and money. Pure, generational money. Up on the main stage, bathed in a warm, expensive spotlight, stood my stepbrother, Elijah. He had a crystal microphone in his hand and that effortless, arrogant smile he had spent 32 years perfecting. He was marrying Qley Harrington, the daughter of Richard Harrington. Richard was a self-made real estate billionaire who basically owned half the commercial properties in the county. Elijah had spent the last 2 years carefully crafting a flawless image of our family to present to the Harringtons, and tonight was his masterpiece. He started his toast by praising his mother, Diane, my stepmom. He called her his rock, the woman who taught him elegance, resilience, and grace. Diane sat at the head table, wearing a dress that cost more than my car, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. She closed her eyes, soaking in the applause like she was accepting an Academy Award. Then Elijah turned to my dad, Robert. Elijah called him a hero. He said, "Robert is the man who stepped up and showed me what a real father looks like. He taught me about hard work and integrity." My dad raised his glass, his eyes actually shining with tears of pride. He looked at Elijah with a level of pure adoration I had not seen directed at me since I was a little boy. Then, Elijah's eyes scanned the massive room. He looked past the tables of wealthy developers, past the partners at his law firm, and his gaze landed on the dark corner where I was sitting. A familiar, cruel smirk touched the corner of his lips. He leaned into the microphone. The pause he took was completely calculated, designed to make sure every single person in the room was listening. "And over there, way in the back," Elijah said, his voice echoing through the speakers. "That is my stepbrother, Joshua. He is just a nurse." He said the word nurse the way you would describe a stain on a rug or a bad habit. It was an apology, something that could not be helped, a disappointment the family bravely tolerated. The room went quiet for a split second, and then, the sound that will echo in my head for the rest of my life cut through the silence. My dad laughed. It wasn't a nervous chuckle. It was a booming, genuine, full-chested laugh. He threw his head back and laughed at me. Diane smirked, lifting her champagne flute to her lips to hide her satisfaction, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the guests. When the groom laughs, the room follows. 120 people were looking at me, chuckling at my expense. I sat there, gripping my water glass so hard I thought the crystal would shatter in my hand. My jaw locked, the muscles in my neck pulled tight. I used the breathing techniques I use in the trauma bay when a patient is coding. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. I did not stand up. I did not storm out. I swallowed the humiliation just like I had swallowed every other insult for the past 20 years. I let the laughter wash over me, making myself as small and invisible as they wanted me to be. But as the laughter died down and conversations resumed, I noticed something. At the head table, one man was not laughing. Richard Harrington, the billionaire father of the bride, sat completely still. His champagne glass was untouched on the table. He was staring directly at me. His eyes were wide, locking onto my face, and then drifting down to the small pearl pin on my lapel. His jaw was slightly open. He leaned over to his wife, Margaret, and whispered something so fiercely she immediately turned to look at me too. I didn't know it yet, but the puzzle pieces were snapping together in his mind. To understand how we got to this freezing moment in the ballroom, and why Richard Harrington was staring at me like he had just seen a ghost, I need to take you back 3 weeks earlier. The wedding invitation arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. It was wedged in my apartment mailbox between a past-due electric bill and a grocery store flyer. I remember standing in my cramped kitchen, my feet aching from a grueling 12-hour shift in the ER. I still smelled like hospital antiseptic and stale coffee. I stared at the thick, cream-colored envelope. It was heavy crane and company paper, pressed with gold foil lettering. I slid my thumb under the seal. Inside, the calligrapher had written my name. Joshua. They spelled it wrong. My own family could not be bothered to spell my name right on a $1,000 stationery order. Furthermore, there was no +1 option checked. It was not an invitation to celebrate our family. It was a summons. They needed me in the background to complete the picture, but they wanted to make sure I took up as little space as possible. Looking at that card, the weight of 20 years settled onto my chest, heavy and suffocating. I was 9 years old when my mother's funeral took place. I remember the cold rain that day, the smell of wet earth, and the way my dad held my hand so tightly it hurt. I thought it was just the two of us against the world. I thought our grief would bond us forever. But less than a year later, Diane walked into our house with her 12-year-old son, Elijah, and the entire architecture of my life collapsed. Elijah was the golden child. He was loud, athletic, demanding, and knew exactly how to manipulate my father's guilt. Diane immediately began remodeling our home and our lives, systematically erasing my mother's memory. My childhood bedroom, the one my mom painted, became Elijah's study space, and I was moved to the small, drafty guest room down the hall. The photos on the staircase changed from family pictures of me and my mom to professional, studio-lit portraits of Elijah playing lacrosse. The ultimate betrayal, the one that broke my relationship with my father forever, came when it was time for college. My mother had set up a small college fund for me before she passed away. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a state school. When I was 18, I went to the bank to access it, only to find the account nearly empty. I confronted my dad in the kitchen that night. I was shaking with anger and panic. He refused to look me in the eye. He scrubbed his face with his hands and mumbled that he had to drain my college fund to pay for Elijah's out-of-state private university tuition. Elijah is going to be a lawyer, Joshua, my dad had said, defending his theft. He needs the pedigree. You're going into nursing. You can easily get student loans. If I don't pay for Elijah's school, Diane will file for divorce. I can't go through that. You have to understand. I understood perfectly. I was the sacrifice. That was the moment I realized I was entirely on my own. I worked night shifts at a diner, lived on instant ramen, and fought tooth and nail to get my nursing degree. I became a trauma nurse because I wanted to be the person who stepped in when people's lives were falling apart. I wanted to be the steady hands in the chaos. I built a life I was proud of, completely independent of them. I threw the wedding invitation onto the counter and decided right then I wasn't going. I didn't need their toxic performance. But 2 hours later, my phone rang. The caller ID said, "Dad." "Hey, Josh." His voice boomed through the speaker, overly cheerful and loud. It was the exact voice he used when Diane or Elijah was in the room listening to him. "Did you get the invite?" "I got it," I said flatly. "They spelled my name wrong. And I have to work that weekend anyway. Look, Josh." His tone instantly dropped the fake cheer, becoming hard and impatient. "Don't do this to me. Elijah is marrying into the Harringtons. This is a huge deal for our family. His new promotion depends on this alliance. Do not ruin your stepbrother's day by playing the victim. Diane has been stressed out of her mind. Just put on a suit, show up, and smile. It is not that hard. Dad, I'm not family to them. I'm a prop. Stop being dramatic. I don't want to hear it. Be at the rehearsal dinner and be at the wedding. End of discussion." He hung up before I could say another word. That night, sitting on my worn-out sofa, I opened Instagram. Elijah had blocked me from his main account years ago, but his public professional profile was wide open. I started scrolling. Elijah had constructed an absolute masterpiece of fiction. There were perfectly filtered photos of him, Diane, and my dad at high-end steakhouses, on rented sailboats, and at charity galas. I wasn't in a single frame. The captions read, "Nothing matters more than my blood. Family is everything." But the lies went deeper. In an interview he posted for a local business magazine, he claimed my dad was an executive in the corporate hardware industry. My dad managed a local Ace hardware store off the highway. He called Diane a retired event management CEO. She used to bake sheet cakes for neighborhood kids' birthdays. Elijah had completely repackaged our family to impress the Harringtons, painting over the rotten wood with a fresh coat of high-gloss paint. I realized then why I was being shoved in the corner. I was a liability to this fake narrative. A trauma nurse pulling 12-hour shifts, driving a beat-up car, and living in a modest apartment didn't fit the billionaire aesthetic. Fast forward to the week of the wedding. The opening act of this nightmare was a mandatory Sunday brunch at the Harrington estate. I pulled up to the massive iron gates in my 10-year-old Honda Civic. The valet attendant, a kid in a crisp uniform, looked at my car like it was a rolling trash can. He parked it directly between a flawless black Rolls-Royce and a silver Porsche 911. The visual contrast was almost comical. The Harrington estate was breathtaking. Stone pillars, manicured hedges trimmed with geometric precision, and an oak double door that looked like it belonged to a European castle. I walked inside, trying to smooth the wrinkles out of my shirt. The house smelled like fresh lilies and old money. Caterers glided silently across the marble floors holding silver trays of caviar, smoked salmon, and champagne. I immediately felt the familiar sensation of becoming invisible. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a tray and tried to find a quiet corner. I walked down a long hallway lined with expensive original art, looking for the bathroom. I passed an open door that led into a massive cherrywood study. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the sheer size of the room, or the walls lined with impressive business awards and real estate plaques. But as I glanced inside, something on the center bookshelf caught my eye. It was a framed photograph next to a clipped newspaper article. I stepped into the room to get a closer look. The headline from a 3-year-old newspaper read, "Local businessman survives horrific highway crash thanks to off-duty nurse." Next to it was a photo of a man in a hospital bed. His face was severely bruised. A thick cervical collar was wrapped tightly around his neck, and oxygen tubes were taped to his nose. My heart did a strange, violent kick in my chest. 3 years ago, on a freezing November night, I was driving home on Interstate 95 after a brutal double shift in the ER. It was pouring rain, visibility was near zero. The tires of a massive 18-wheeler locked up ahead of me, and the truck jackknifed across 3 lanes of traffic. A black luxury sedan crashed head-on into the side of the trailer with a sickening crunch of metal. I pulled my car to the shoulder, grabbed my emergency trauma kit from the trunk, and sprinted through the freezing rain and shattered glass. The driver of the sedan was pinned violently beneath the crushed steering column. Blood was pouring from a deep laceration on his forehead, blinding him. I crawled into the twisted wreckage, ignoring the jagged metal tearing my scrubs and slicing my arms. For 47 minutes, while we waited for the rescue crews to bring the jaws of life, I held his cervical spine completely still. I pressed my bare hands against his neck, keeping him stabilized so he wouldn't be paralyzed. I talked to him constantly so he wouldn't pass out from the shock and blood loss. I told him about my mom. I told him about her pearl earrings, how they glowed in the light, anything to keep his mind anchored to the living world while his body was failing. I never got his name, and I left the hospital before he woke up from surgery. I looked closer at the framed photo on the shelf. The swollen, bruised face. Could it be Richard Harrington? Before my brain could connect the final dots, a hand gripped my shoulder like a vice. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I spun around. Elijah was standing in the doorway, his face twisted in genuine fury. He yanked me by the arm, dragging me out of the study and into the hallway. "This is Mr. Harrington's private office," Elijah hissed, pushing me against the wall. "You don't just wander around people's houses. God, you are so embarrassing. Stay out of sight and stop snooping. You are lucky to even breathe the air in this house." He didn't wait for my answer. He turned and walked back toward the laughter and the clinking glasses of the party. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding against my ribs. The image of that hospital bed burned into my mind. I walked out to the back patio where the main brunch was happening under a massive white tent. Elijah was holding court near the outdoor bar, his arm wrapped tightly around Qley's waist. He was loud, charming, and completely in his element. I stood by a stone fountain, watching my family perform. Diane was laughing at something Margaret Harrington, the mother of the bride, was saying. My dad was nodding along, looking terribly uncomfortable in a blazer that was slightly too tight around the shoulders. Margaret Harrington noticed me standing alone. She had kind eyes and an elegance that didn't feel forced or fake. She excused herself from Diane and walked over to me. "Hello?" Margaret smiled warmly, extending her hand. "I don't believe we've formally met. I'm Margaret, Qley's mother. You must be Joshua." I shook her hand. "Yes, ma'am. It's beautiful here. Thank you for having me." "Qley tells me you work at St. Luke's Regional," Margaret said, her tone full of genuine curiosity and respect. "That must be incredibly demanding work. What department are you in?" Before I could open my mouth to answer, Diane materialized out of nowhere like a ghost. She slid her arm through Margaret's, her acrylic nails digging slightly into the woman's fabric, and let out a high, artificial laugh. "Oh, Margaret, you don't want to bore yourself talking about hospitals and sick people on such a lovely day," Diane said smoothly, physically steering Margaret away from me. "Come look at the floral arrangements for the centerpieces. The florist just sent over the mock-ups. Joshua is just fine catching his breath. Aren't you, sweetie?" She shot me a look that could freeze boiling water. I watched them walk away, feeling the familiar sting of erasure. Needing a moment to breathe, I slipped away from the main tent and walked up to a second-floor stone balcony that overlooked the garden. It was quiet up there. I leaned against the railing, letting the cool breeze hit my face. Below me, tucked into a small alcove near the rose bushes, stood Tyler, one of Elijah's groomsmen, talking to a bridesmaid. They were completely out of sight of the main party, and their voices drifted perfectly up to the balcony. "Where is the stepbrother anyway?" the bridesmaid asked, sipping a mimosa. "I haven't seen him all day." "Oh, the nurse guy?" Tyler chuckled softly. "Elijah says they try to keep him away from big crowds. Apparently, the guy has severe anger management problems, like legit mental issues. Elijah told Mr. Harrington that the family had to cut him off financially because he was so unstable. Sad, really. Elijah acts so brave about it, taking the high road and still inviting him." I stopped breathing. The stone railing beneath my hands felt like ice. My vision tunneled. Mental issues, anger problems, unstable. Elijah hadn't just hidden me. He had actively destroyed my character to the Harrington family. He had painted me as a mentally unstable pariah to ensure they would never question why I wasn't part of his perfect family portrait. He fabricated a mental illness to cover his own cruelty. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were shaking. I dialed my father's number. I looked down into the crowd and saw my dad standing near the buffet table. He pulled his phone out, looked at the screen, sighed heavily, and walked away from the crowd before answering. "What is it, Joshua?" "I'm busy," he muttered. "Dad." My voice was shaking, but not from sadness. It was pure, unadulterated rage. "I just overheard Tyler talking. Did Elijah tell the Harringtons that I have mental health issues? That I'm unstable and prone to anger?" Silence on the line. I stared down at the top of my father's head in the garden below. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he had when he was caught in a lie. "Joshua, keep your voice down," my dad whispered sharply. "It's not a big deal. Elijah just needed to explain why you aren't around much. He was just managing the narrative so the Harringtons wouldn't ask too many questions about our family dynamic." Managing the narrative? I spat the words out. "He told them I was crazy, Dad. He assassinated my character to make himself look like a saint. And you knew? Tell me you didn't agree to this." "Look, Josh," Robert's voice hardened. "It is just easier this way. Do not cause a scene and do not make me hire a lawyer to deal with the fallout. Just keep your head down. It's one weekend." He hung up. I lowered the phone. A cold, heavy realization settled into my bones. My father wasn't just a passive bystander. He was an active participant in my destruction. Which brings us back to the rehearsal dinner. Back to the Oakmont Country Club. Back to table 14 by the kitchen doors, where Elijah stood on the stage, the microphone amplifying his sneer as he called me just a nurse. Back to the sound of my father laughing at my expense. I didn't stay for dessert. The moment the speeches ended and the string quartet started playing again, I stood up and walked straight toward the men's room. I needed to splash cold water on my face before I did something that would actually justify Elijah's fake stories about my anger. The bathroom was lined with imported Italian marble and smelled like expensive cedarwood. I turned on the gold faucet and gripped the edges of the sink, staring at my reflection. My jaw was tight, a muscle ticking in my cheek. The heavy oak door swung open behind me. Elijah walked in. He checked to make sure we were alone, and then the charming public smile melted right off his face. He stepped up to the sink next to me, turning on the water to wash his hands. "You look like a stray dog sitting over there at that table," Elijah said quietly, not looking at me, just looking at my reflection in the mirror. I grabbed a linen towel and dried my hands. I didn't say a word. "I saw you staring daggers at me during my speech," he continued, turning to face me. He pointed a wet finger at my chest. "Listen to me very carefully. Tomorrow is my wedding day. I am getting a major promotion at my corporate law firm specifically because I am marrying into the Harrington family. I will be handling their real estate acquisitions. This is the biggest weekend of my life. Do not screw it up with your pathetic pity party." "You told them I was mentally unstable," I said, my voice dangerously low. Elijah rolled his eyes, utterly unbothered. "Oh, grow up. I gave them a reason to pity you so they wouldn't ask why you're a 30-year-old nurse who still drives a beat-up Honda. I did you a favor. Just know your place, Joshua. Sit in the back, eat the free food, and keep your mouth shut." He threw his damp towel into the brass basket and walked out. I stood there, listening to the heavy door click shut. Know your place. I took a deep breath. He thought he had won. He thought I was broken. The next afternoon was the wedding day, the main event. I drove up to the Harrington estate just as the sun was beginning to set. The front drive looked like a luxury car dealership. The valet attendants were sprinting back and forth, parking rows of red Ferraris, sleek Lamborghinis, and massive G-Wagons. I handed the keys of my Honda Civic to a teenager in a vest, ignoring the slightly amused look on his face. I didn't care anymore. The reception was held inside a colossal glass-paneled tent erected on the back lawn. Thousands of fairy lights hung from the ceiling, mimicking a starry night sky. I found my seating card. Table 18. If table 14 at the rehearsal dinner was an insult, table 18 was an execution. It was literally positioned behind a massive floral pillar, right next to the entrance the waitstaff used to bring out the food. I sat down. The 2 chairs next to me were empty, no-shows. On my other side was Grace, a college student who had been hired to watch the flower girls. I smoothed the lapels of my dark suit. The small pearl pin caught the ambient light, glowing softly against the dark fabric. I touched it gently. I am here, Mom, I thought. I am surviving. The grand entrance happened. Elijah and Qley danced onto the floor to thunderous applause. My dad and Diane were seated at the front, beaming, raising their glasses. The dinner service began. Waiters rushed past my table, their elbows brushing the back of my chair. I ate my steak in silence, watching the spectacle from the shadows. About an hour into the dinner, the music softened. People were mingling between tables. I was staring at the condensation dripping down my water glass when I noticed a shadow fall over my table. I looked up. Standing there, wearing a custom tuxedo with a look of intense, almost trembling focus on his face, was Richard Harrington. He didn't look at the empty chairs. He didn't look at the waiters rushing past. His eyes were locked entirely on me. He pulled out the empty chair next to mine, the chair meant for a no-show guest, and sat down. At the worst table in the room, the billionaire host took a seat. "You know," Richard said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the noise of the room fade away. He stared at his hands resting on the table. 3 years ago, I was in a terrible accident. Interstate 95. A truck jackknifed in the rain. My heart stopped. The blood rushed to my ears, a loud roaring sound drowning out the jazz band. My car was crushed, Richard continued, turning his head slowly to look at me. I was trapped. I was bleeding out. I couldn't feel my legs. I was terrified, and I was absolutely certain I was going to die in the dark, in the rain. He paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. But someone climbed into that wreckage. Someone held my neck still for 47 minutes. He talked to me. He told me he was a nurse. He told me about his mother and her pearl earrings. Richard's eyes dropped from my face to the lapel of my jacket. He stared at the pearl pin. A single tear broke loose and tracked down his weathered cheek. "I tried to find him," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "The hospital wouldn't release his name due to privacy laws. But I never forgot his voice. I never forgot the story about the pearls." He reached out and gently tapped the table in front of me. "Is it you?" Richard asked. I looked into the eyes of the man I had pulled from the edge of the grave. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Yes, sir," I said quietly. "It's me." Richard closed his eyes. He let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for 3 years. He stood up slowly, placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezed it tight, and walked away without another word. I watched him walk straight past the head table, ignoring Elijah, ignoring Diane. He pulled his cell phone out of his tuxedo pocket and walked out of the tent into the dark garden. He was making a call to the hospital to verify my identity. The storm wasn't just coming. It was already here. I sat at table 18, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird inside my chest. The jazz band was playing a slow, sweeping rendition of an old Frank Sinatra song, the upright bass thumping in time with my pulse. But all I could really hear was the rushing blood in my ears. I watched through the clear plastic walls of the massive reception tent as Richard Harrington stood out in the dark garden. He had his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. He was pacing back and forth under the soft glow of a security light, his free hand slicing through the cool night air as he spoke with an intensity that you could feel even from 50 feet away. I did not know it at that exact second, but Richard was not calling his security team or his driver. He was calling St. Luke's Regional Hospital. He completely bypassed the General Hospital switchboard and used his considerable weight as a major philanthropic donor to get directly through to the emergency department's attending physician on duty. That physician happened to be Dr. Matthew, my boss and a man who has mentored me for years. I found out later exactly how that intense conversation went down. Richard demanded to know if a male nurse named Joshua, a man who consistently wore a repurposed pearl lapel pin on his scrubs or his jacket, was the lead medical responder on a massive multi-vehicle pileup on Interstate 95 3 years ago. Dr. Matthew is a man who plays entirely by the rules. He firmly refused to violate medical privacy regulations at first. But Richard was absolutely relentless. Richard described the exact nature of the severe injuries he sustained that night, the exact time frame of the crash, and the exact, specific words the young nurse had spoken to him while they waited in the freezing rain for the heavy rescue tools to arrive. Finally, hearing the sheer desperation and gratitude in the billionaire's voice, Dr. Matthew broke his silence. He confirmed that I was the trauma nurse who crawled into that crushed, bleeding sedan. He told Richard that I had received a private, high-level hospital commendation for my heroic actions that night. It was an award I had quietly placed in a cheap desk drawer at my apartment and never spoken about to my family, because I knew with absolute certainty they would find a way to belittle it or make it about Elijah. I watched Richard Harrington end the call. He slowly lowered the phone from his ear, stared up at the dark, starless night sky for a long, heavy moment, and took a deep breath that seemed to physically expand his entire chest. When he finally turned and walked back toward the glowing reception tent, his posture had completely changed. He did not look like an affable, welcoming father of the bride anymore. He looked like a ruthless corporate CEO preparing to aggressively dismantle a terrible investment. He walked back into the warmth of the tent, completely ignoring the waitstaff trying to offer him glasses of dessert wine. He marched straight past my table without looking at me, his eyes locked dead ahead. He walked with a terrifying purpose straight up to the main stage where the wedding band was just finishing their set. The wedding MC, a man in a shiny suit holding a clipboard, stepped forward with a bright, plastic smile, likely preparing to announce the cutting of the cake. Richard simply reached out, gripped the crystal microphone, and took it right out of the MC's hand without saying a word. Richard tapped the top of the microphone with his index finger. The sharp, heavy thud echoed through the massive concert-grade speakers, instantly cutting through the low chatter, the clinking of heavy silverware, and the soft ambient music. 200 high society guests stopped whatever they were doing and turned their heads toward the stage in unison. "Excuse me," Richard's voice boomed. It was a voice heavily accustomed to commanding boardrooms and closing multi-million-dollar deals, a voice that demanded absolute silence. "I need everyone's attention right now. I have something extremely important to say." Up at the head table, Elijah smiled confidently. He leaned back in his luxurious chair, draped his arm comfortably over his new wife, Qley, and crossed his legs. He clearly thought his wealthy new father-in-law was about to deliver another glowing, emotional tribute to their perfect union. He thought this was another speech to validate the fake, flawless reality he had spent 2 years building. Diane adjusted her posture, smoothing the fabric of her expensive gown and making sure she was sitting perfectly straight for the photographers who were quickly circling the stage. My father, Robert, held his glass of scotch, a look of proud anticipation plastered on his face. Richard did not look at Elijah. He stood at the absolute center of the stage, holding the microphone with a grip of iron. Most of you sitting in this room tonight know that 3 years ago, I was involved in a horrific, near-fatal accident on Interstate 95, Richard began. The room instantly fell into a pin-drop silence. You could hear the wind rustling the canvas of the tent. A commercial truck jackknifed in the pouring rain. My car slammed into it at highway speeds. The front end of my vehicle was completely crushed inward. The heavy steering column pinned my legs to the floorboard, and the roof collapsed directly onto my head. I was bleeding profusely from a severe head wound. I could not move a single muscle. I was in agonizing pain. I was terrified, and I was absolutely convinced that I was taking my final breaths on this earth. He paused, letting the heavy, brutal reality of his words settle over the crowd of people wearing expensive jewelry and custom designer suits. For 47 agonizing minutes, before the paramedics could arrive, before the fire department could bring the heavy rescue tools to cut me out, I was kept alive by one single person, Richard continued. his voice thick with a raw, unfiltered emotion that made my own throat tighten. A young man crawled into the jagged, twisted metal of my car. He completely ignored the broken glass tearing through his own skin. He held my cervical spine perfectly still with his bare hands so that I would not be permanently paralyzed. He talked to me the entire time. He told me about his late mother. He told me about her beautiful pearl earrings to give me something gentle and beautiful to focus on while I bled in the cold dark. Qley was staring up at her father, tears rapidly welling in her eyes, her hands covering her mouth. Margaret Harrington sat frozen, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I tried for 3 long years to find this man. I hired private investigators. I begged the hospital administration. But he never came forward seeking a financial reward. He never asked for public recognition. He simply saved my life and walked away into the night because that is exactly the kind of incredible man he is. Richard took a slow, deliberate step forward on the stage. The bright spotlight tracked his movement. Tonight, by a sheer miracle, I finally found him. The collective gasp that rippled through the massive tent was entirely audible. 200 people held their breath, waiting for the revelation. The man who saved my life is sitting right here in this tent tonight. He is sitting at table 18. His name is Joshua. Every single head in the room snapped around to look at me. The movement was so sudden and synchronized it felt like a wave crashing. I was sitting under the dim light near the kitchen's swinging doors, wearing my cheap, off-the-rack gray suit, with the small pearl pin gleaming softly on my lapel. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, my face flushing under the intense weight of 200 stares. But I did not look away. I planted my feet on the floor and held my head high. Earlier tonight, Richard's voice hardened, transforming from emotional gratitude into a sharp, dangerous weapon. He turned his head slowly to glare directly down at the head table. The groom stood on this very stage and thought it was incredibly amusing to introduce Joshua as just a nurse. I watched members of his own family laugh at him like he was a joke. Elijah's confident, arrogant smile vanished completely. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet ash. He looked like a panicked ghost. Diane's mouth fell open in sheer, unadulterated horror. My dad, Robert, froze completely stiff, a glass of water hovering halfway to his lips, his eyes wide with a sudden, crushing realization. "Let me tell you exactly what just a nurse means," Richard thundered, his voice echoing fiercely through the speakers, shaking the very air in the tent. "It means kneeling in freezing rain and shattered glass to hold a dying stranger together. It means possessing a level of character, integrity, and selfless courage that most of the people laughing tonight could never even comprehend. Joshua is a hero. He is the only reason I am standing here to witness my daughter's wedding today." Someone at a table near the front started clapping. It was a slow, deliberate, powerful clap. Then, a prominent local real estate developer stood up and joined in. Within 5 seconds, a massive, unstoppable wave of movement swept through the tent. One by one, then table by table, the guests pushed their chairs back and stood up. The applause roared like a physical force. It was a deafening standing ovation, directed entirely at the man they had shoved into the darkest, most humiliating corner of the room. I stood up slowly. My knees were visibly shaking, but I looked directly at Richard Harrington and nodded respectfully. Up at the head table, the illusion violently shattered. Elijah panicked. His carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was disintegrating in real time in front of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the state. In a moment of pure, unfiltered desperation, Elijah entirely lost control. He jumped to his feet, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the floor. "He should have stayed invisible," Elijah screamed, his voice cracking wildly, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at me. "He ruined everything. He is mentally unstable." The thunderous applause abruptly died. The silence that followed was heavy and deafening. Elijah stood there, chest heaving, realizing a second too late that he did not have a microphone, but his true, ugly, vicious nature had just been broadcast to everyone who mattered. He had just publicly confirmed his own cruelty. Qley looked up at her new husband as if she were looking at a dangerous stranger who had just broken into her home. She stood up abruptly, her stunning designer wedding dress rustling loudly in the painfully quiet tent. She took 2 large steps away from him. "What did you just say?" Qley asked, her voice trembling with absolute horror and disgust. "Elijah, what is wrong with you?" Before Elijah could stammer out a pathetic excuse or try to spin his outburst, Margaret Harrington rose from her seat. Margaret possessed that quiet, terrifying authority that only comes from decades of holding immense social and financial power. She calmly walked around the head table, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor, and stood directly in front of Diane and Elijah. "For 2 entire years, you sat in my home and told my family that Joshua suffered from severe mental health issues," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly and coldly across the front tables. "You told us he was prone to violent, unpredictable anger and that your family had to distance yourselves for your own safety. You completely fabricated a malicious, evil lie about a man who spends his life saving others, just so you could hide him away and pretend you were a flawless, high-society family." Diane tried to speak, her hands fluttering nervously around her expensive borrowed necklace, her face flushed red with absolute humiliation. "Margaret, please, you have to understand. We were just trying to protect your family from his awkwardness. He doesn't fit in. Do not insult my intelligence, Diane," Margaret snapped, cutting her off instantly, her eyes flashing with pure disdain. "You are frauds. Your entire narrative is a toxic lie. You are not welcome in our lives." Richard stepped down from the stage, his face a mask of determined focus. He walked purposefully through the parted crowd of guests until he reached my table in the back corner. He stood right in front of me and extended his hand. I shook it firmly, feeling the solid, honest weight of his grip. "Joshua," Richard said, his voice carrying clearly to the surrounding guests who were watching with bated breath, "my family owes you an unpayable debt, and I promise you, by tomorrow morning, the Harrington Foundation will ensure you are properly rewarded for your heroism and your absolute professional dedication. As for the rest of your so-called family, they are going to have a lot to answer for." This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The reception did not recover from the shockwave. The jazz band awkwardly tried to play softly again, but the celebratory energy was entirely dead. Guests were whispering behind their hands, casting harsh, judging glances at the head table where Elijah sat slumped with his head in his hands, while Qley stood several feet away, refusing to even look in his direction. I desperately needed fresh air. My chest felt tight from the adrenaline. I walked out of the tent, leaving the heavy stairs behind, and navigated the stone pathways until I found a secluded, dimly lit balcony overlooking the lower gardens. I stood there, gripping the cold stone railing, letting the crisp night air wash over my burning face. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest since I was 9 years old was completely gone. I felt incredibly light. I felt utterly vindicated. I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind me. I turned around to see my dad, Robert. His suit looked incredibly rumpled, and he looked 10 years older than he had just an hour ago. His eyes were bloodshot, and tears were spilling down his cheeks, catching the dim light of the balcony lanterns. "Joshua," he choked out, taking a hesitant step toward me with his hands held out in a pleading gesture. "Joshua, I am so sorry. I didn't know he was going to say those horrible things on stage. I swear to you, I didn't know. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, the man who was supposed to be my hero. I searched my heart, and I realized I felt no anger anymore. I just felt a deep, hollow pity for an incredibly weak man." "You laughed, Dad," I said quietly, my voice eerily calm. He called me just a nurse and humiliated me in front of 120 strangers, and you threw your head back and laughed. You didn't know what he was going to say, but you absolutely agreed with it when he said it. No, I was just caught up in the moment. I was just trying to keep the peace with Diane. You know how she gets, he pleaded, the tears flowing freely down his face now, his voice cracking. Keeping the peace meant sacrificing your own son, I replied, my voice steady, cold, and final. It meant standing by while they abused me. It meant actively draining my college fund to pay for his tuition so you wouldn't have to deal with an argument. It meant letting them treat me like a stray dog in my own home. You chose them, Dad. You chose them every single day since Mom's funeral. Please, he sobbed, reaching out to grab my arm. Let me fix this. Let me make it right. I'm your father. I stepped back out of his reach. I established the firm boundary I should have set a decade ago. There is nothing left to fix. You are not my family. You are just a man who happened to be married to my mother. Go back to your wife and your golden child. They are going to need you when the Harringtons are done destroying them. I turned my back on him and walked away, leaving him weeping alone in the dark on the balcony. I walked straight to the valet, handed him my ticket, and drove my beat-up Honda Civic out of the massive iron gates. I rolled the windows down and let the cold wind fill the car. I had never felt more free in my entire life. A time jump of exactly 1 week is all it took to watch Elijah and Diane's fake, glittering empire completely crumble into dust. I certainly didn't seek out the information myself, but in a wealthy town like ours, gossip involving a billionaire family travels faster than the speed of light. Tyler, the groomsman who had originally spilled the toxic secret about my supposed mental illness on the balcony, actually tracked down my personal cell phone number and called me. He profusely apologized for believing Elijah's lies, and then he eagerly filled me in on the massive fallout. Elijah's life became a living, breathing nightmare of his own making. The Harringtons were ruthless, incredibly protective business people who absolutely despised being manipulated. Qley did not file for divorce on Sunday morning, but she packed her bags, left their shared apartment, and moved back into her parents' estate the very morning after the wedding. Richard Harrington immediately contacted Elijah's prestigious corporate law firm. Elijah was explicitly hired and slated to handle Richard's massive commercial real estate portfolio, which was the entire reason Elijah was guaranteed a massive promotion to junior partner. Richard brutally pulled all of his accounts. The law firm partners, furious at losing their biggest, most lucrative client because of an associate's personal lies, completely revoked Elijah's promotion on the spot. They placed him on indefinite administrative leave pending a severe character and ethics review. He was functionally unemployed. Furthermore, Richard and Margaret sat Elijah down with a terrifying team of corporate lawyers. They delivered a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum regarding Qley's massive trust fund and her future inheritance. Elijah was completely cut off from any and all financial support. They drafted a postnuptial agreement that left him with nothing. He was legally ordered to attend intensive behavioral therapy twice a week to address his narcissistic lying and emotional abuse. If he missed a single therapy session, Qley's high-powered divorce lawyer had the papers drawn up and ready to file with the courts. Elijah had spent his entire life bullying me to fuel his own sense of power, and now he was financially and legally trapped in a marriage where he had absolutely zero control. As for Diane, her relentless social climbing hit a concrete brick wall. Margaret Harrington made exactly 3 phone calls to the wealthy heads of the local country club and the exclusive charity boards Diane was so desperate to join. Overnight, Diane became a complete social pariah. Her phone completely stopped ringing. The wealthy friends she had tried so hard to impress suddenly did not have time for lunch or coffee. Her carefully curated, fake Instagram account went completely silent after hundreds of people started leaving mocking comments about her fake CEO status and her cruel treatment of her stepson. She was ruined. While their shallow, fake world was rapidly shrinking into nothing, mine was expanding in incredible ways I never thought possible. On a bright Tuesday morning, while I was sitting in the dingy break room at the hospital drinking a terrible cup of cheap coffee, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number from the high-rise downtown financial district. "Hello, is this Joshua?" A crisp, highly professional woman's voice asked. "Speaking. Joshua, my name is Claire. I am the executive director of the Harrington Foundation. Richard Harrington asked me to reach out to you personally this morning." I sat up a little straighter in my plastic chair. "Okay, what can I do for you, Claire?" "Actually, it is what we are going to do for you," she said, her voice warming up considerably. "Mr. Harrington has officially established a new, heavily funded branch of our philanthropic trust, specifically designated for first responders and medical professionals who demonstrate exceptional bravery off the clock. He has proudly named you the inaugural recipient. The board of directors has unanimously approved a $200,000 educational and lifestyle grant in your name. You can use it to completely pay off any remaining student loans you took out when your college fund was compromised, fund your advanced trauma certifications, or simply put a down payment on a house. The funds are yours, completely tax-free." I dropped my coffee cup. It clattered loudly onto the cheap linoleum floor, splashing brown liquid everywhere. $200,000? I whispered, my voice completely failing me. "Yes, Joshua. And furthermore, Richard personally spoke with your hospital administrator, Dr. Matthew. We understand you were already next in line for a major promotion to charge nurse of the trauma unit. The foundation is making a substantial, multi-million-dollar donation to the hospital's emergency wing in your honor. Because of this, Dr. Matthew asked me to let you know your promotion is officially approved starting next Monday, which comes with a very significant bump in your annual salary." I sat alone in that quiet break room, staring blankly at the spilled coffee on the floor, and for the first time since my mother died when I was 9 years old, I cried. They were not tears of pain, rejection, or loneliness. They were tears of overwhelming, pure, unadulterated relief. The universe had finally beautifully balanced the scales. Exactly 2 days after that incredible phone call from Claire, a thick, heavy envelope arrived in my apartment mailbox. The handwriting on the front was shaky, rushed, and unfortunately very familiar. It was from my father. I took the envelope inside, made myself a hot cup of tea to calm my nerves, and sat at my small, scratched kitchen table. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages of densely packed, handwritten text on yellow legal paper. Robert poured his entire heart out onto those pages. He wrote extensively about his crushing guilt, about how he had been an absolute coward for 20 years. He openly admitted that he let Diane completely manipulate him because he was utterly terrified of being alone again after my mother's funeral. He confessed that stealing my college fund to pay for Elijah's law school was the single greatest regret of his miserable life. He wrote that standing on that balcony the night of the wedding felt like attending a second funeral, a funeral for the father he was supposed to be. He shamelessly begged for a second chance. He begged to take me to dinner, to start over, to somehow earn custody of our relationship back before it was too late. I read every single word carefully, absorbing the ink. I felt the profound sorrow and desperation radiating from the pages. But as I reached the very end of the 3rd page, I realized something incredibly important about myself. I did not feel any burning anger anymore, but I also did not feel a single ounce of desire to pick up the phone and call him. The emotional cord was permanently cut. You cannot deliberately starve a child of affection and basic respect for 20 years, throw them to the wolves for your own selfish comfort, and then expect a single, tear-stained letter of apology to magically rebuild the burned bridge when the wolves finally turn around and bite you. I folded the letter neatly along its original creases. I walked slowly into my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my wooden nightstand. I placed the letter inside, shut the drawer firmly, and walked away. I did not write him back. I did not call him. My absolute, unwavering silence was the final, devastating answer he would ever receive from me. True peace comes from finally knowing you no longer have to carry someone else's toxic, heavy baggage. It has been 6 full months since the disastrous wedding that changed the trajectory of my life. Yesterday morning, I walked through the sliding glass doors of St. Luke's Regional Hospital for my early morning shift. I confidently swiped my security keycard at the main desk, and the heavy double doors to the trauma bay slid open. I looked down at my crisp, clean scrubs. Clipped securely to my chest pocket was a brand new, shiny silver badge that clearly read, Joshua, Charge Nurse, Trauma Department. Pinned right next to that shiny new badge was the small, elegant pearl lapel pin. It catches the harsh, bright fluorescent lights of the hospital corridors and glows softly, serving as a constant, beautiful reminder of exactly where I came from and exactly who I am. I am no longer the invisible boy hiding in the guest room. I am the man who runs the most chaotic, high-stakes room in the entire building. I am the steady hands in the storm. When I got home later that evening to my brand new, spacious apartment, comfortably paid for by my significant salary increase and the total lack of crushing student debt, I checked my mail. Sitting right on top of the pile of catalogs was a thick, expensive, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't a wedding summons demanding I sit in the corner. It was a warm, heartfelt invitation for a massive Thanksgiving dinner at the Harrington estate. Margaret Harrington had included a personal, handwritten note inside the card. We have a seat saved right next to Richard at the head of the table. He refuses to carve the turkey until you get here. We can't wait to see you. For the very first time in 20 long, lonely years, I finally have a family that actually wants me sitting at their table. Looking back at this entire insane, emotional journey, the greatest lesson I learned is about the undeniable, unbreakable power of self-worth and the absolute reality of karma. We so often let the toxic people closest to us, sometimes even our own blood, define our value in this world. When my own father and stepbrother treated me like I was a worthless embarrassment, a joke to be laughed at, I spent years quietly accepting that terrible role. I sat in the dark corners. I swallowed the vicious insults. But the beautiful truth is, your inherent value does not decrease simply because of someone else's inability to see your worth. I kept doing the right thing even when it was incredibly hard. I worked grueling shifts. I saved a stranger's life without ever asking for a reward or a parade. And I stayed entirely true to my own morals. Karma is not always immediate, but I promise you, it is absolute. Elijah thought he could build an arrogant empire on lies and cruelty, and he ended up miserably trapped in a legal and financial prison of his own making. I focused purely on building a life of quiet integrity, and it eventually brought me entirely out of the shadows and into the bright light. You simply cannot fake genuine character, and eventually, the world will test you to see what you are really made of. I would love to know what you took away from my story today. What is the one lesson or perspective about family, boundaries, or karma that resonated with you the most? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, or simply type the word good, so I know you found real value in my journey. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, never, ever let anyone relegate you to the back table of your own life.